Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCG live codes, make sure you check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. For today's video, we have 6 online tournaments to go over, and we'll also discuss the metagame in general as we are creeping into the first set of regional and special events over the next coming weeks of the Obsidian Flames format. It's quite a short window until we get the introduction of 151, so really having your finger on the pulse is going to be important for this small mini format that we have. You guys enjoyed the shorter, more concise version like I did last week, so we're going to stick to looking at the first place lists and then anything that's caught my eye tournament to tournament. We'll start off with the Tournament of Doom, and the winning deck list was a Rapid Strike Inteleon deck. Nothing too outlandish about this one. It seems like it's actually pretty much exactly Cyrus's NAIC 60, and Urshie's had a fairly decent week, to be honest with you. So we've seen this and basically 58 cards pop up a number of times throughout the week, which is looking pretty good. A lot of other standard lists, nothing against those, but we all know the skeletons by now. Did just want to highlight that the pure Chen Palk is currently outside the top 10, but I think a lot of people respect this archetype as just being a consistent performer that kind of just does its thing and is sometimes powerful enough to break through, and really just preys on the inconsistencies of the format and tries to have some power spikes with Cologne and cities with your Greninja essentially is the idea. It has Starmie in here for some potential other burst potential outside of your Star Portal play with Chien-Pao. Outside of that, it's something that we've seen a little bit over and over again, but I think it's kind of worth noting when there are decks sitting outside the top 10 that do make it into the overall top 8. Next up, we have the Battle Park 150 codes. It was won by a Gardevoir, and an interesting Gardevoir at that. This is kind of reminiscent of the Aussie build, I want to call it, that we saw from Brent Tonneson at the World Championships and the whole testing crew. The idea with the extra Zacian and the extra Forest Seal Stone is just to cherry pick, definitely like VIP pass if you need them, getting those candies as well. Basically just being a more versatile option rather than having that third copy of Rare Candy or something like that. And it has the double collapse to try and remove these as well when need be. And essentially saying that Worker is more of an insta-play card compared to the Professor's Research, and it's at least drawing you cards throughout the game, adding to your overall dig into the deck, and adds to your overall stadium bounces, which is definitely more than the sort of traditional Gardevoirs. It's not the only time this one's done well throughout the week, so it seems to be a great alternative here. I'm still kind of against the idea of not having any reversal energy in the deck list, but because this leans into Zacian so much, that's why you're seeing a heavier focus on pure basic energy, and just saying that Storm Slash is the way to go here. There was also a couple of interesting Charizard lists in the top 8. First, we have Cash's build, which is still playing that Pidgeot, but rather than playing Arc V-Star, it's choosing to play a slightly lower to the ground package of Entei and Luminion V, as well as the Arven, and one copy of Forest Seal Stone, as well as the Town Store. So a few ways to access Forest, and Forest ideally is getting you either the candy or the Pidge, and then the Pidge is hoping to do enough for you. The amount of times I've played this deck and needed exactly the Pidge and the candy, or something else along those lines, just the immediate burst potential of Arc I still feel is quite powerful, and I don't think Entei's damage output is like really worthwhile enough to be in the deck as a vulnerable 2-prize Pokemon. I suppose the upside of Entei and Luminion is that they actually get knocked out pretty quickly, and then it makes your Charizard more powerful, so it almost baits the opponent into initiating their prize race possibly a little bit earlier into the game, which I think is an interesting thing to think about. I still personally do enjoy the Charizard, especially when Arven's just at the 2 copies. I feel like if you really want to lean into that Forest, you probably need to have more of them, but I do like at least Choice Band and Vit Band as tutorable cards because they are very powerful with Charizard. Vit Band being very strong after you've given up one prize card, Choice Belt being very powerful towards the latter stages. A different take, you open up some space by not playing Arc to some extent, but I'm not really seeing those spaces dedicated to like extra ball search or anything like that. It's the same sort of consistency spaces that you would see with an Arc build. The idea is, I suppose, that it's easier just to get like a turn 2 Forest Sealstone play with a regular V, in comparison to getting a turn 1 Arc necessary to get that V-Star active. So the Arc V-Star kind of front loads the amount of things you need, but turn 2 gives you extra value, whereas this list can sort of have a worse turn 1 and still end up getting towards a candy combo turn 2. So it's a slightly roundabout way of thinking about things, but can't really question the fact that Luminion's just like a decent consistency card in the deck. Forest Hill Stone, decent consistency card, so I do understand the logic, and I like that people are experimenting with Charizard because we haven't seen enough success from the Arc build to think, yes, that's the way to go. There was also another Charizard in the top 8, and it's a Barrel list that still plays the Arc, so kind of the inverse of what we've just seen, where it's playing the Arc but not the Pidge, and instead playing Barrel for some top-ups throughout the game. I find it really strange that it's still playing Forest Arven, because you're already playing the Arc, so a bit of a mishmash going on here, but some other interesting ideas in the spongy gloves coming in so that you can possibly hit Chen Pao a little bit earlier, potentially. I feel like the Vit Band still does the job there for the most part. Possibly it helps you reach on like Intel as well, but I don't think it's that powerful, to be honest with you. Also, just playing 3-3 Charizard, 3 Candy makes me kind of squirm a little bit, so I'd like to see higher counts of these in the deck list. We move on to the Pumpka tournament, and it was a Gardevoir winning this one, and this time it's James Cox, and he's also playing the Australian build, no surprise there really, part of the testing crew I imagine, or at least in the group chats and whatnot, and another good result for this deck list, so seems to be a great alternative to the sort of taught approach that we have seen as of late. The wave of Colorless Lugia continues to do well, as we see once again this build of Lugia popping up here, there, and everywhere. I'm going to do a comparison towards the end of the video in terms of the matchup spreads, the difference between Colorless and Single Strikes. I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail later. There is the third gift to try and make the Echoing Horn possibly a little bit better. Playing a Vacuum and playing no Mesagoza is interesting. Is it to help out against potential Bravery Charms, I suppose? Maybe that's the logic here. I think in Japan a lot of them just play Collapsed anyway, so it's not like too crazy to see 3 count total of bounces with the pump in here as well. So yeah, looking like a pretty solid list, trying out the Luminous Radiant Charizard. I still feel like Luxray is valuable, and Charizard was always a little bit iffier for me, but it's one of those things. There was also a Chen Pao in the top 4, and it was quite an interesting list in that we're not seeing Arc Bibarrel that we typically see. Instead, we're just seeing the 1-1 Palkia, and is playing a copy of Worker in addition to 4 Physical Stadium and Lost Vacuum. Has the space for a Bravery Charm in here as well, just as like a Power Spike card, I suppose. So definitely a different take on Chen backs, really, that we've been seeing lately. I'm going to put more time into this archetype because I keep putting it low tier and the stats are saying it's bad, but I was really intrigued by actually Mike Foucher's data. You can check out his Twitter because it seemed like Chen Pao Baxcalibur performed quite well in Day 2 of the World Championships, which makes me think that if the sort of better pilots are gravitating towards this archetype, there's maybe something more to it, especially because Chen Bax actually boasts one of the highest win rates into Gardevoir if we're going off of the Day 2 Worlds data. So something I'm going to put more time into, and maybe it changes my mind on Chen Pao. I kind of made up my own mind with Chen Pao fairly early after like a month of testing it, and the data keeps telling me that it's exactly in the same position that it always was. But this new Day 2 data has given me new reason to explore the archetype. Art Gudra popped up again with another top 8. We actually looked at this list last week, but it seems to be here to stay, possibly. There's still not much murmurings going on about Gudra at all, but it's once again showing up in the online data, so that's always cool to see. The other real thing that stole the show was this super interesting build of Lost Zone box, where you're obviously very focused on the Cram Sableye package, where we have the double vacuums, we have a ton of switch outs, we have all of that jazz going on, even gears, so that you're not missing the Colrus. So your main intention is to do the Cram Sableye thing, but then there's also the gates and an Earthen Sealstone package here, putting counters on each of your opponent's Pokemon V until there's 100 remaining, and you can use this alongside the Dummy Doll Mimikyu V. When you put this Pokemon from your hand onto your bench, you can prevent all damage done to this Mimikyu V by attacks from your opponent's Pokemon until the end of your opponent's next turn. So it's a 2-prize Pokemon, but it doesn't give up any prize cards the turn it comes into play, which is fantastic unless there's some random Rote Boss shenanigans. And it has the Jealous Eyes attack. If you want to use this option, you can do. For 1 Psychic, you put 3 counters on your opponent's active for each prize card your opponent has taken. But in general, I imagine you go Dummy Doll, Gate, Attach, Earthen play, and you either set up, you essentially set up some Pokemon for either a Hawlucha Greninja multi-prize turn, or just Sableye coming in and finishing off some multi-prize Pokemon. So a really cool concept. The thing I like about this list is that it just in general ramps Cram and Sableye very religiously. It gets to 10 fast, it has the Echoing Horn plays, It has a lot of draw from Pokestops, gears, and whatnot, so you just get into the game naturally from all the draw that's in the deck. You've really just tried to throw as much consistency in the opening stages as you can into the deck list, and then you have the wombo combo potential. But once again, Mimikyu's okay to just go Clara it back or something and just get an energy drop on it, and you're still doing something. So a really cool, really innovative list. I'm going to explore this a little bit more as well myself, because I again think this has a lot of good logic to it in that the consistency is just there. It's nailed with the counts going on. So you're getting your plan A off of just lots of Cram, lots of Sableye, which works in a ton of matchups. The only things that I'm a little bit skeptical of is like the Lugia matchup, where this consistent pressure just isn't quite as good. However, one thing I will say is that a lot of Lugia are dropping Radiant Serena now, and that might give you the incentive to go Greninja the double Archeops into the Sableye Sprinkle play, and that is a nice 2-prize turn, and then it just leaves them with whatever attackers are currently on the board. And I suppose with Echoing Horn, if you are able to target a Luminion, this, that, and the other, you can try and bring it back. You'd be a little bit vulnerable, I imagine, to their Collapse Stadiums, but that would be my only concern with an archetype like this. Outside of that, it's looking very, very solid, to be honest with you. Speaking of Lugia, we go to the Deck Out Mondays, and it's Andrew Hedrick with a win with a single strike build of Lugia. Very consistent, very simplistic list, playing no copies of Jet Energy whatsoever, so it's a bit of a throwback to the good old days where you're just playing kind of the good, tried and trusted energy. Jets are a little bit weird in this deck in that you kind of just have to draw them at the right time, and otherwise they are blanks. So having the extra copy of the Gift, the extra copy of the V-Guard, these are very powerful cards, of course. So I do see the justification there. Andrew actually is still playing the Radiant Serena, ironically, even though we just discussed that sometimes being a cut these days. But overall, it's nothing too out of the ordinary from Lugia, and it's doing good work. The rest of the top 8 isn't too surprising. There were a couple Chien-Pao, but there's nothing too much to write home about with these deck lists, more of the same that we've seen from this archetype. We then go to the late night. Let's have a quick look at the general metagame for this one, the biggest one that we've had in the week. And Gardevoir seems to be the most popular archetype, followed by Lost Zone Giratina, and Lost Box and Miraidon are actually tied for the third most popular right now. If I had to guess going into the first regional, I would say Guardi, Tina, and Lost Zone Box would be probably the 3 most popular, but seeing Miraidon, Lugia, and even Intel isn't too surprising that these are all fairly popular right now. They're all seeing success. I think Mew is, interestingly, quite low for its percentages. I'd thought there'd still be a bigger cult following, especially post-Worlds, but there doesn't seem to be a huge amount of people piloting it, even though its win percentage overall was pretty high, so it should still be an archetype that's being respected. Arc seems to be falling off the face. I know its data recently hasn't been great, and it did poorly at Worlds, but I really think the trap has been that people have gone towards this grass package, and it just seems to be wasted spots in the deck, where if we went back to almost like a pre-World 60, it would be performing better into the other top archetypes, where it's that challenge to Lost Box. It can be frustrating for Guardia, especially with the right tool cards being included into the deck list. So I feel like it could make its way back into the format. I feel like it's being disrespected right now, but also I think that the online format has focused so much on Charizard and not the general field, and that's really where we should be concerning ourselves. The one thing I will say is that Miraidon might be stealing its thunder a little bit right now and is a more aggressive version of the archetype, so there is something to be said about that. Onto the standings then, and it is a Miraidon Flaffy that was able to win out. It's Sagen, it's his pure aggro list that we saw at the World Championships, and it seems like he's the only one piloting this deck, but just doing well over and over again. I think the general consensus is that this archetype kind of needs that path to give it that extra dimension. But Sagen is proving otherwise and just proving that raw aggression can be a win condition with the deck. Still playing trusty Flying P over the Zero Aura single prize option, and that's because sometimes coin flips from Thundershock and Fly win you games. And as a VGC player, he'll take those 50-50s all day. TCG players seem to be very against coin flips, but if you ask VG players, sometimes they're playing towards the 10%ers, so getting that 50% is a real treat. And that's why we're seeing Sagen continue to play this Flying P and still having good success with it. Shintaro was also playing Miraidon, and it's more of a straightforward list with the Path of the Peaks that we have seen from the World Championships, playing triple Iono, triple Judge. Outside of that, more of the same, really, even having very high counts of that Bravery Charm. A pretty consistent list, not too different from what we've seen previously. It is incorporating the Radiant Greninja, which I feel is interesting, just to sort of lay it on the board, and whenever a path is bounced, you do get some extra digs. And I feel like this has upside over Squawk. I haven't used Squawk all that much in my testing with Miraidon, and having a bit of on-board draw isn't a bad idea, so I do think this is something we should be exploring as well with Miraidon, even with a high counted path. Another super interesting list from this top 8 was an Arc Regigigas V-Star deck, still playing the Bibarel Squovet package, is playing Greninja alongside Sharon's Care, but also it's that Poppy combination that we saw pop up initially with the Arc Pidgeot deck. You have the option to go spreading your energy across your Gigas and Arceus, and then at some point in the game you can Poppy onto Greninja and get a burst of Moonlight Shuriken, which some people may not expect, especially in a closed deck list. I think in open deck list this is less powerful, but possibly in a tournament setting this is going to be an even better combination. So something to keep your eye on, certainly. When you are seeing Greninja pop up in Arc, you might actually have to start respecting it and put your Manaphy's into play, so something to bear in mind. Just reminding ourselves of this Regigigas V-Star. 230 is still not a fantastic number, but it's fairly similar to like Dura in that it can be good for gusting up Pokemon and taking knockouts cleanly on evolving Vs, which is pretty nice. And the Star Guardian V-Star power is something that probably won't come up too often because Arc needs to use its own V-Star power so much. But if ever you can forego Arceus, you can attempt this. If your opponent goes down to one prize card remaining, you can choose one of your opponent's bench Pokemon and discard it and all cards attached. The idea being that you can maybe push something out the way for an easier knockout whilst also discarding their biggest threat on the board at the same time. But as you can see, it's a path-based build. You have no other bounce to this stadium, so I think it's still a Starbirth style deck, and we're just using Gigas for its size and its similarity to Duraludon, really, with the upside of being a Sharon's Careable target. We end on the full heal Obsidian number 4, and it's a Lost Zone box winning the tournament. It's a turbo-based build, still playing those Pokestops. I haven't seen much experimentation with the town store. It's something that we're trying with our friend group, and it's been pretty okay. I like just having access to Forest Seal Stone more often, because it still is kind of the lifeblood of the archetype, because it's so important not only for finding Colorless, but also just a vacuum target immediately to ramp to that 7. But I can't really question Pokestop either. It's extra reach towards VIP and Switch cards, and in this list we're seeing some Pokegear as well, so it's not something I'm necessarily against either. Just a bit of a tug-of-war between the new and the old stadiums right now. But this seems to be a pretty cookie-cutter build of the Turbo Lost Box, and that really is the outline of the top 8 as well. Some standard archetypes, yes, there's Cash in there again, but it's the same Charizard list we've already seen, and we also have a sort of standard Pidgeot Arc build going into the top 8 as well of Charizard. So not a bad week for Charizard overall. It's been popping up here and there, and there has been some experimentation, so a little bit interesting. Overall, though, a lot of standard stuff still floating towards the top tables. Let's have a look at the matchup data and the overall success of decks in the Obsidian Flames online format, and it's still Giratina way out in front in number of top 8 placements. That's what this ranking is for. Then we see Guardian, Lost Zone Box neck and neck. Miraidon is popular but succeeding. Urshi Intel is way up there. I'm a little bit surprised about how Single Strike Lugia is doing. I thought it had a better week previously, and it's had an okay week this time around, but it seems like some of its meta percentage is being shared with the Colorless build, which is actually the 11th best performer. So if you would put the Single Strike and Colorless builds together, they might actually end up being the 4th best performer as Lugia on the whole. So I imagine it would probably go above Miraidon, but not quite above Lost Box if I'm looking at the percentages correctly. So that's something to bear in mind. Lugia is still a big threat in the game, probably in the top 5 of archetypes if I had to put my finger on it. Arctina's kind of dropped off. It had like a couple of weeks of popularity when Charizard was filling up these online events, but now that Charizard's died down, the sort of grass wonky stuff is not working in Arctina anymore, so we should be reverting this deck back to where it was, with that caveat that it is worried about Miraidon and an uptick in Urshi. So there's a possible reason why Arctina should remain around like the 8th to 10th best deck in the game right now. I'm surprised by how Fusion Mew's performing. Again, I guess in the early weeks people were concerned about Charizard and were choosing not to play it, but I feel like it's going to be a good play again for the next few weeks of tournaments, to be honest with you. I don't really expect a huge amount of Spiritomb in decks outside of maybe Arc, and Chien-Pao still hanging on in there. Let's have a look at the matchup data then. This is from the 17th of August up till the 7th of September. Again, it looks like the things that we've come to know staying true. Chien-Pao still with a very poor win rate. Arctina's win rate is far worse now than it was at Worlds, which is just reinforcing my concept of the list has got worse, basically. You put so much time into having like a reasonable Charizard that you're forgetting the rest of the meta, and I feel like we should dedicate those spots back to the general consistency cards or just like those tools that helped out, like the Cleansing Gloves or the Box of Disaster or whatever else, to make us have a better time into these other matchups. Charizard's data is still looking pretty woeful. Fusion Mew's looking pretty interesting. Guardy's looking much better than it has over the last few weeks, with only a very poor like single strike Lugia matchup. And I feel like a lot of the reason why its percentages used to be higher was the Temple of Sinnohs in the deck list, and that's pretty much always out of Guardy now. People either going for workers or for vacuums in that spot, which is sacrificing your Lugia quite substantially by the data. Tina's still good for its sort of Bediff status, I want to say. The Lugia Archeops, the Colorless build, is kind of the biggest challenger to it right now, and part of the reason possibly why the Colorless build is doing so well in the online data is that it is seeming to farm the otherwise unchecked deck in the game. So that's a real interesting uptick, that Tina's gained a new awkward matchup. Seems to be like the best challenge to the deck, which I think is really interesting. Intel Urshi, as we know, dodge and weave, some sub 10%, which is a really woeful matchup for you. And bearing in mind, like some of the Intels we looked at today were playing double Drap in their list, or they were playing the Spiritomb Giacomo, so it's really, really poor. Some people are even choosing to tech and they're getting mugged off by Mew here and there. Lost Box looking very strong, especially when Arctine is on the decline, and that's your worst matchup, so I feel like that's going to have a good couple of weeks. Lugia's looking great. Miraidon's also looking pretty well established, honestly. Path seems to have completely changed its spread. And Palkia's having a bit of a shakier time. The Miraidon's popping up, the Colorless Lugia's popping up, and even Single Strike. These are all things you don't really enjoy seeing. So I feel like that deck's going to remain outside the top 10, even though it has like the respect of people, I suppose, for being a consistent deck, if nothing else, which is cool. The last thing I wanted to just touch on was a quick side-by-side comparison of the two builds. So the Lugia Archeops is the Colorless build, and the Single Strike is obviously playing the T-Tars, the Stonjourner, and the Yveltal. The sort of big differentiators, I want to say, is that the Single Strike build prefers the Gardevoir matchup. It also has a slightly better time into Miraidon Flaffy, although it's still really weak. Outside of that, pretty much everything is better for the Colorless build of Lugia. And what I think is super interesting, you're gaining almost 7% in favor into the Giratina matchup, which is super popular right now, and I expect it to be, if not the most popular deck, definitely in that top 3 of popularity. So, genuine reason to be looking at the Colorless build of Lugia. There still seems to be no Dura in the format, and maybe there'll be a tipping point of Colorless Lugia's return, but it still feels like most people are laying their hats on the Single Strike build, but Colorless has great data behind it, so it's an archetype that I've enjoyed in the past. You don't have to play Urns in the deck, which gains a couple of consistency spaces, which is really nice. And you get to represent a more difficult single prize board state and still have the burst potential of like Drapion into the Mew matchup and the Guardy matchup, because you can just power it up with energies, for example. So you still have that burst damage. And yes, Weird is a thing, and there's not much Spiritomb right now, so maybe there's a chance that Colorless is kind of like on full cylinders for the first time, and we haven't seen that for a while. So yeah, I'm interested in Lugia and seeing if people are confident enough to bring the Colorless build. I think there was some hype of Colorless Lugia going into the EUIC, but Dura did so well at the EUIC that it completely like went off the map again. But in Japan, it seems to be really popular. They, of course, are able to use Mew EX, which is probably a big reason for why Colorless Lugia is so popular right now. But the data is telling me that this could be a deck in the game, and that it just hasn't got the confidence of players in-person tournaments yet. But that could be changing this weekend. Let me know your thoughts down below. Hope you enjoyed today's video, and I'll see you tomorrow for another one. Cheers.